We invite you to meet people producing knowledge outside the mainstream institutions, people doing research in very precarious ways, or even having to leave their countries in order to keep the engagement in science and technology studies. We have tried to make this conference as porous as possible in its boundaries, including invited speakers from other fields and contexts, and working to generate workshops and encounters with activists, artists, and other scholars beyond the walls of the conference venue. You can check the program and you will see that there are some activities that will be developed not here but in other places in the city. In addition, we implemented all possible measures to accept as many papers as possible from the more than 2,500 proposals received. That was an idea. After a long and complex process with the inestimable work of conveners, we have been able to allocate 1746 papers in 109 open tracks and 90 closed sessions, and there will be 32 sessions in parallel every day, besides today. With almost 2,000 registered participants, yesterday we were 1998. This is probably the largest East Forest conference ever. But I have to say that we are aware that papers that deserved to be here did not finally be accepted, but there were no more room. It was impossible to find more space to allocate everything. And following this inclusive aim, we have tried to be loyal to an ethic of care in our relation with each and every one of those who have expressed interest in taking part in this conference, from encouraging and caring evaluation of papers to a careful attention to all of the practicalities and requests arrived to us. There is something that we also want to mention here, and it has to do with plenaries and sub-plenaries. We want you to know that we have tried to offer a real development of the conference theme. It has been easy thanks to the collaboration and complicity of a significant amount of people that very kindly have accepted to participate in them. We have tried to be faithful to the spirit of the motto, and these plenaries and sub-plenaries are actually plenaries and sub-plenaries by other means. We have avoided the standard format of a keynote speaker given a conference, and I insist, thanks to this complicity we found in those who are participating in these plenaries and sub-plenaries, we will have the opportunity to witness the development of dialogues, debates, even theatrical performances, with the aim to achieve very creative encounters. Now, it only rests. We ask you to be involved in this adventure and be as participant as possible. And well, we must be quick. Just, I want to finish, but just I want to remind you that all the local committee people will be in the conference ready to help you. We will wear an orange badge, not me in that moment, but I will. So you will recognize us easily. There will be volunteers with black t-shirts that also will help you as much as possible. So don't hesitate to ask us, come to us, and we will try to help you as much as possible. And well, let me just ask you to have fun.
which is much larger than any other held. As well as that being due to the energy and enthusiasm of our hosts, it obviously is also an indicator of the fact that our field has grown from a rather small marginal activity in the academic world to one that is much more extensive and pervasive. And clearly the growth of the field takes a long time. We're marking at this conference the 50th anniversary of some key foundational institutions in the field, the Science Studies Unit at Edinburgh University, the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, both hitting their 50th anniversary. And clearly, originally they were pioneers on the sidelines, and now our field is much more centre stage. But that's probably oversimplifying it, because the field still doesn't fit comfortably into many dominant institutional frameworks, either in universities or in disciplines. And we have constant a role to play in maintaining the position of our field. And in that sense, I would like to emphasise, in my view, the greater importance of our own collective scholarly organisations in the modern university landscape. The landscape you're all familiar with, which has become increasingly driven by competition between universities and between disciplines for occupying space. And it's very important that we maintain our own collective presence to try and promote and develop what we believe and is important to us. So on that, I'd simply say anyone who shares that commitment, we're keen to have people participating in the Council of East to promote that in the future. So I would ask
those of us who are native English speakers recognize and appreciate the privilege that surrounds us, though I'm sure not enough. I'm honored to be the current president of For Us, which this year marks its 40th anniversary as a society. The first For Us meeting, with less than 100 people in attendance, was held in 1976 at Cornell University, and that event will be commemorated in October of this year in Ithaca, New York, which coincidentally was the place of my birth only a few years before. Most relevant for us here is the fact that our two societies have met jointly every fourth year since 1984, beginning in Ghent, Belgium, followed by meetings in the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Austria, France, and Denmark. And this year is a very special pleasure to be here in Spain, and more specifically Barcelona. The organizing committee has named the theme of our gathering Science and Technology by Other Means, building on an aphorism introduced into the STS literature by Bruno Latour, who in 1988 explores the proposition that science is politics by other means in his book, The Pasteurization of France. It's worth noting that Latour's phrase is a citation of one written a century and a half before, in 1832, by the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz, who explored and questioned the thesis that we might understand war as the continuation of politics by other means. As STS scholars, we recognize now that all forms of human activity can be characterized as politics by other means, insofar as we understand politics to be characterized as matters of encounter, ordering, and distribution. At the same time, we can resist ideas like the proposition that war is a logical extension of politics if we insist that the means matter and that other means are possible. It's the question of means, how they matter, and what other means are possible that we'll be exploring together over the next 3 days. Further, we can take as a lesson of STS that the separability of means and ends is itself a premise that we want to treat as open to question. As Isabel Stengers and Philippe Pignard write in their manifesto, Capitalist Sorcery, Breaking the Spell, quote, pragmatism is an art of consequences, an art of paying attention that is opposed to the philosophy of the omelette justifying the cracked eggs, end of quote. The point is not that we never crack any eggs, but that rather than treating that as an externality, we include the act of breaking and its consequences as something intrinsic to our practice, for which we're responsible, and as a trouble, as John Harroway has so succinctly phrased it, with which we need to stay. There will be ample time to discuss these ideas and a plethora of others over the next few days, but in the meantime, I don't want to wait until the end, although we will thank them again then, to acknowledge the truly extraordinary work of the local organizing committee. That is Nerea Calvillo, Tomas Criado, Mikel Domenech, Daniel Lopez Gomez, Vincenzo Pavone, Israel Rodriguez Girat, Carmen Romero Bachiller, and Francisco Tirado, and also at the outstanding administrative assistants from the conference secretariat with whom many of us have communicated, Miriam Arenas and Rosios Tovar. So once again, welcome to East for Us, Barcelona, 2016.
Okay, we'll now move on to our panel session, so if the speakers would like to come up. I was intrigued to find out that this initiative had been launched within the past couple of years, and that a group of science and technology scholars were playing a very active role within it. Our field of science and technology studies was a fundamental questioning of the model of progress that had been promoted in the post-war period. And I think some of the concepts that we now take for granted in our field actually emerged in precisely that context. The notion that progress shouldn't be seen as a unilinear process, but can have a diversity of pathways to follow. Secondly, that we need to think in terms of the socio-technical rather than the impact of technology on society. Thirdly, that knowledge, which is an important contributor to any notion of progress, is itself situated and varied.
Create this panel was twofold. One is kind of dissatisfaction with the International Panel on Climate Change, which is dominated by the sciences and doesn't really talk about social justice. So when we think about the future of the world, it is about climate change, but also about social justice. So the idea was we need a complementary effort. But the second reason was that somehow the social sciences, including economics, have lost the ability to talk about social progress. Or perhaps the question is, can we still talk about social progress? Today I treated this question as who's afraid to talk about social progress? And if you want to talk about it, how can we talk about it? So these two reasons were the kind of background. The International Panel on Social Progress is non-governmental. That's the real difference with the UN-driven International Panel on Climate Change that has its pros and cons. The idea that we can come up with some kind of conditionally prescriptive statements, but the main thing to understand is that the panel is an experiment in itself. The panel is producing a report like the International Panel on Climate Change in a 3-year period. And while this gives some of the elements, there are 22 chapters, there are over 300 authors put together, working together for the first time. So these authors have never worked together. And there was a decision that science and technology should be a central topic in the report. So this is the process, and the important thing to understand is that we are halfway through. So we started in January 2014, a small group of people convening, designing this chapter structure. Then there was a process of bringing together authors. There was a meeting in Istanbul at the time, in August 2015. There was a separate meeting then of the SDS authors, because each chapter was the idea should have an SDS author. They came together in Germany, and now we are at the phase where we are producing the first chapters. I think there are 12 chapters ready, and the others are coming very, very soon. So the coming 5 months, there's a period for commenting. And that's why we're also here, because we want you to provide input and to comment. There are 3 types of authors. There's coordinating lead authors, there's lead authors and contributing authors. I don't want to go into this, but this is the structure of the International Panel on Climate Change. They have a similar structure. The role of the SDS authors. So there's a dual role. So we have in each chapter, we have a so-called designated SDS authors. Here we have a collection of SDS authors. But then we also try to coordinate horizontally. So these are the chapters. I just give you the names here are the names of the SDS authors. And you see some of them have no SDS author yet because we were unable to find one very quickly. So these are the first 8 chapters. Then we next one, the chapters you can read yourself very quickly. This is all on the website, of course, where you also can find all the author names. And these are the final ones. Okay, so the SDS authors, 80 people, came together in Germany at a Canada House workshop to discuss what is the SDS approach to social progress. And we came up with a number of pointers. And these have been published on the International Panel on Social Progress website. The first one is that if you want to talk about technology in the context of social progress, you should talk about science, you should talk about co-production, co-construction, all of these terms we know about. So we should avoid technological determinism. So one of the tasks of the SDS office is in a way a negative one to prevent certain language in the report. The other contribution is that progress, if you want to discuss progress, you should talk about many types of actors. Not just about engineers, scientists, but also about users, about civil society, about government. So we want to ensure that many types of actors are mentioned. We also want to ensure that it's not only about high tech, but also about what's called low tech, which is of course a label in itself. So we really need to ensure that there are many types of practices in the report that we reflect on social progress. The third principle was that we want to talk about multiple pathways. There's not one pathway to progress, but there's a variety of pathways. So how can we talk about variety? The last one was that we wanted to avoid the diffusion story, as if social progress is invented in the West. And the question is, how can we bring it to the rest? The idea is that social progress is generated in many localities, in many places, so it's more an issue of circulation and appropriation. So that's the fourth principle. And the fifth principle is kind of overarching principle that knowledge is part of the social process that includes the report itself. So as STS authors, we should reflect on the production process here. So what is the report? What is it doing? Who's included, who's excluded? So the last chapter, we want to make this contribution that we talk about and reflect about the report itself.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got just a short space for any questions or comments on that overall approach. If you look around you, we don't have a roving microphone, but we have microphones positioned in different parts. So, yes, there's a microphone over there.
Yeah, you did mention the audience in the report. The audience is in the report. You not have
Yeah. Well, the audience are policy audience. So the idea is that when the report is published, so there's now a commenting phase, then all the authors, or as many as possible, will come together in a meeting in Lisbon. I think it's the end of January. And then there will be a final report produced, and then there's a whole process of bringing the report to the policy audience, basically. Because the idea is to, like the International Panel on Climate Change, to influence policymakers, international organizations, national governments, and also local governments.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Les, yes, there's a late ringing microphone. Okay, just one sentence, so we can all hear you. That'd be nice.
Well, of course, progress forms, but doesn't it also have lifting? Almost compatible.
Sorry, I had difficulty hearing your question.
Right again.
Not just multiple forms.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Are these plural forms of progress compatible or incompatible, conflicting, antagonistic with each other? That's the central question.
I agree. I think it will come out in some of the contributions here. But let me also say that the process itself is a process of conflict. Because we as STS authors have to work with many other people who are working in completely different paradigms. We have neoclassical economists. In my chapter, I'm working in chapter 1. I had to work with many neo-Marxist people who have very specific views about progress. So the conflict is built into the writing process of the report, in fact. And the aim is to produce one text, but to allow for minority views.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, so in Land Convention, I'll just say around Johnny from King's College London. So I think it'd be a good start, and it's a good thing to do. But I'll just make one quick comment, which is I'm surprised not to see any definition of outcomes. You've got these 5 kind of definitions of social progress as approaches to define it, let's put it that way. Well, don't we need to have some definitions of outcomes? Like, how would we know progress if we saw it? What would be a progressive outcome? So I would be immediately thinking of things like improving health outcomes, improving various social conditions. I mean, clarity about what counts as progress in terms of outcomes seems to be absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, the main idea here is that we aim for social justice, human flourishing. So that's the kind of outcome. And of course, how you measure it, we have a separate chapter. Startup is part of the chapter, so we will talk about this. It's called Social Progress, a compass, where this question is explicitly on the table. And it's not an easy question, so because it's plural in itself, the answer is not one answer. But there is a tendency in the report to come up with one answer. Or there's an attempt by several philosophers to do that.
I was thinking about from Cuba's report. I wonder what's the thinking behind framing this process as an international panel. So why confirming the nation state as a central part of thinking about social progress?
Yeah. Well, I didn't think that there was a lot of thought behind this. It's the International Panel on Climate Change, so it's called international. But I think in several of the chapters, it will be problematized, the role of the nation state. So there's a lot of attention to transnational processes. So the panel could be called differently, but I would not pay too much attention to the fact that it's called international. In any case, the audience is a set of international, transnational organizations.
Okay, just a final point before we move on. Yes, community seems quite centrally involved in this. Can you just explain how that came about? Because I could easily have seen such a venture simply being run by the conventional international disciplines. So do you want to just explain a bit how this happened?
Well, I would say the prime cause is Helga Nowotny. She's part of the steering committee, so she was there early on, and she recruited me to the scientific council, and we made a plea for having SDS as a kind of special horizontal activity, which does not exist in the International Panel on Climate Change. So you have all the chapters written, but there's no horizontal activity. So in that sense, it's an invention in producing a report like this. And it makes things more complex, of course, because you have a horizontal process and you have a chapter items, and how do you coordinate all of this? And it also led to some irritation in the process, because I was talking to some other chapter coordinating lead office about the fact that they need to take account of STS efforts. Well, they say, well, we are running this chapter, so who are you? But it's Helga Nowotny, basically. I was her assistant.
My name is Dr. Leijzer, University of Amsterdam. These umbrella reports, in the climate change process, they have the clear function of setting research agendas. And the question is now, because research agendas are very important also for STS, how does this translate, this umbrella type of thinking, into research agendas, and can it be analyzed in terms of research agendas? And is that a consideration for the committee to think about? And how does that work out? Perhaps these are too many questions. My focus would be on asking you, how do research agendas emerge? What's the vision of the committee?
I don't think it was so explicitly discussed. Not in the discussion. The discussion was can we find a platform and a way of talking to each other and come up with a joint view? And what are the differences? So where do we agree and where do we disagree with the social sciences? And of course, the research agenda can be generated from that. And the second step, there's more concern in the people leading this for policy implementation. But I do think you're right, and I think that's a good point, that the research agendas can easily follow from this. Again, this is the first round. It's a very chaotic process at the moment. So we're producing the first report, and if it is successful, it will be a continuous effort. Every 3 years, write a new report about social progress in the world.
Okay, we better move on since time is pressing. So, chapter 2, the title is called Social Progress, a Compass. And Sarah Barora is the SDS president in that chapter, and he's going to share some of his views and experience of the process.
Thank you. I'm actually going to quickly present 50,000 words in 5 minutes. So that's 10,000 words per minute, so I think I've already won the fastest rapping competition in the world. So the aim of this chapter is to lay out the normative dimensions of social progress. And the way it's basically led by ethicists, American ethicists and somebody based in Louvain in Belgium. So what they do is they propose values and principles to basically assess, so values to assess social progress outcomes, and principles to guide possible directions of social progress, possible actions of social progress. So principles are there basically to achieve social justice, and social justice is presented in many different ways, but primarily in terms of respect for rights and equality of opportunity. And these principles are targeted at governments. For example, rule of law, accountability, transparency, political participation, and targeted at civil society, where they include toleration, pluralism, and individuals in their informal relationships as well, so they talk about cultivating a cooperative and charitable efforts. About values, these are to evaluate, as I said, whether societies have achieved social progress. So these values are for human well-being, so we talk about esteem, recognition, solidarity, freedom, these values, and then beyond human well-being, we talk about intrinsic values associated with cultural goods and intrinsic value of human values. Now, the SDS part, which is what I have been trying to write, of course, this my contribution is only a few thousand words, and it of course builds on a contribution to scholarship in SDS by Isla Stengers, Latour, Michel Calon, Manuel Moore, Andy Sterling, Brian Wynn, and a few others. So what I'm trying to start, so my starting point in this case is not individual actors, individual human actors, or collective human actors in the case of the grand collective state or civil society, but I take practices of making artifacts and practices of knowing as my unit of analysis, where these principles apply to. So principles that I propose do not apply to individuals necessarily, but to practices of knowing and making. And values in that sense are imminent in specific to these practices. So I'm trying to develop as this contribution the notion of what I'm calling minority practices. And these minority practices are basically trying to say that these are not practices of a minority social group, but minority is a characteristic or a set of characteristics of the practice itself. And if I may use those principles that sort of circumvent modernist confrontations through which modern techno sciences gain authority and legitimacy by disqualifying other ways of knowing, other ways of doing, other ways of making artifacts that are classified as irrational. Be they indigenous, traditional, be they shamanic, be they religious, and so on. So minority practices, as I propose, are basically, they have three primary characteristics. First, they are non-normal, in the sense that they do not present themselves, they refuse to conform to universal truths, and they do not present themselves as what others can follow and build upon and catch up to. So they are to try to go beyond catch-up. They are very nice principles to develop and maintain affinity across distributions of difference. And again, the aim really is to get out of a confrontationist, conflict-based mode of engagement between different ways of knowing towards a more peaceful engagement in different ways of knowing between making artifacts.
Okay, so thank you for your heroic summary of practice. There is tension between the dominant approach that's been adopted in the chapter on values and principles and your frame in terms of practice. Is that right?
Yes, there is a bit of a tension, and you're trying to solve it correctly.
Can you get it resolved by coexistence rather than
I think what you're trying now is to resolve it by coexistence, so that I get a small section in the whole chapter where I talk about practices rather than individual practice. Okay, practice.
Are there any comments on this approach to the compass in terms of social progress that anyone would like to put into our discussion now? Taking John's point earlier on outcomes,
Yes.
you've identified these 4 outcomes, but there's a sort of process there.
The processes.
Yeah. Could you? No, I know. That's why I'm relating it. So, I think other types of outcome, which I think my understanding is the Sustainable Development Goals are a reference point in the report to what might be articulated. So rather than the panel getting bogged down and articulating these goals, they've taken a visible, contemporary summary of goals based on certain political consensus. Do you want to just talk about them, having those process targets and the relationship of that to the outcomes in the SDG and other senses of the word?
Well, first of all, there is in the chapter itself, the main chapter, the real chapter as it stands without any SDS indicating for me. They've got values that they define as already mentioned, esteem, recognition, solidarity, and a few others, which they then use and propose as ways to assess outcomes, societal outcomes for social progress. So whether one has been achieved in terms of health or education, in terms of SDGs or environmental conservation. And they will be able to address using these human well-being values and beyond human well-being values, which would be intrinsic values to the environment and cultural goods. So that's their proposal to do that. Yeah? And of course, in the contribution that I'm trying to make, outcomes of very different nature, and it's about how practices are able to thrive and
Well, it's a question to you, but also to the panel. The question of reflexivity, which was not mentioned. So, well, if you apply the principle proposed to the writing of a chapter, what does it mean? So basically, well, I suppose that you're a member of a work which is very limited to do that. But I think it would be interesting because most of the things your 4 principles actually, it means that the social justice cannot be the monopoly of ethicists.
I totally agree. Social justice cannot be the monopoly of ethicists, and this is why we have to talk about social justice in practice terms, which is what I'm trying to do here. And there has to be a greater degree of flexibility in the chapter, which at this moment is not there. And also, I've got 2,500 words out of 50,000. So that, or 45,000. So that doesn't give me much room to talk about flexibility, but I think I should be. But on the other hand, the flexibility here must be seen as flexibility is distributed across all the different practices and activities. That they are talking about themselves, practices and practices. It's not just about the flexibility of the authors of the report, it should be there, I agree, but also the flexibility of the audience and the objects about which we're talking about.
Following question also to Johan as the porte-parole of the ELTA, perhaps, is it possible to make a report on social progress only by experts? So what is your view on the participation of so-called non-experts, non-social scientists, in the process of producing the report?
At the moment, this role is minimal on that. So you could say we have a number of spokespersons for some of them, and therefore one of the principles we had was that in the report at least a whole range of actors, including the marginalized, so it should be represented. They are represented by experts. So in that sense, it's not very inclusive. And also, if you look at the audience, it's mainly a high-level policy audience. It's aimed at. So it's a specific type of activity. And I think, yeah, that demands and needs reflection and reflexivity. And that's precisely what we are calling for. Just as the SOs we were called in, so to say, in a certain structure. So we decided to work with them. But if this effort really
things we do. And in that sense, that gave me the impetus to spend some of my time on that, because I found it so interesting that, again, you always withdraw because you don't have a big idea how to change everything everywhere, including everybody. And so I do think it's kind of work that needs to be done once, that it's just the start of something, a conversation that needs to be reenacted in many different places. And it also needs to be reenacted in the research agenda way, in the sense of, would there be other kinds of questions that would have to be asked if we want to understand, for example, in my chapter, what actually the term equality could mean in a world that is so deeply different? So how would we want to make things equal without equalizing everybody in that sense? I mean, how do we deal with difference and equality and stuff like that, which is not easy to do?
Can I add one thing? I think the chapters are going to be at least distributed, the draft chapters, to my audiences as well, so get feedback. So there is some degree of feedback to be gotten from others.
I'm a guru from Deakin University in Australia. I'm actually looking at education in a similar way, trying to shift from outcomes to practices, and trying to see what happens to accountability there, and trying to see if we can distribute accountability amongst more actors. Otherwise, it always ends up with just being teachers in schools. And I'm sure you must have seen something like that. Now, I was just thinking in saying that you have X number of words out of, a much larger chapter. Have there been conversations with you and your co-authors that actually change those kinds of things, or is it kind of, more like a jigsaw rather than kind of collaboration? And is there scope for actually changing that? Because I think that's probably where the rubber is the road really, when it comes to who's held accountable for things that happen or not.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I think the thing is, the way the structure is that each chapter has a coordinating lead authors, which in my case are clinicists, and then a bunch of lead, I think they just call it lead authors, right? So coordinating lead authors do much of the organization and much of the vision setting and for the chapters. In my conversations with them, it was quite difficult to get them to budge from the unit of analysis being the human actor or the creative as the grant-creator in the state or society. So I couldn't manage to do that. In fact, to be honest, I was told that I have a non-mainstream perspective, but they are mainstream methods. So it was very difficult to break through. So that's why the negotiation now is to just get a section in which I'm proposing a different way of looking at things, distributed way of looking at action.
That's great. We're going to have to move on because we're pressed for time. We're doing sort of skate over so many big, complex, different issues, but that's what we've set ourselves up to do. So, chapter 11 is about international organisations and governments, and Ethan Medina's going to give us a brief summary of where we're at there.
So I'm Adina, and I'm representing Chapter 11, International Organizations and Technologies of Governance. Our coordinating lead authors are Hilary Charlesworth from the University of Melbourne. Her research is in the area of feminist international law. And also Sally Berry at NYU, who directs the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and also is an anthropologist of law. I'm going to quickly state my co-authors, just to give you an idea of geographical representation. My co-lead authors include B.S. Chini from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, Javier Pozo from the Universidad de Bogotá in Chile, Terry Halliday from the American Bar Foundation, Uti Proponen from the University of Copenhagen, Finland, Vivian Lin from the World Health Organization, so there was a question about international representation and nation as the unit of analysis. We also have people involved from international and transnational organizations. Leslie Oliora from the University of Arizona, Cesar Rodriguez Garrido from the Universidad de Los Andes in Colombia, Greg Schaefer from the University of California, Irvine, Renee Urenia from the Universidad de Los Andes in Colombia, and then as a collaborating author, we have Ruth Okeji from Harvard University. And I want to say that so that you have an idea of representation of countries outside of the United States and Europe. And also, it's worth pointing out that many of the people who were involved in this chapter come from the world of law, so in different ways. So they're lawyers or legal scholars, and many of them are affiliated with the interdisciplinary field of law and society. And I bring this up because law and society
network for the Law and Society Association that has to do with STS. So if you're interested in that, come find me after. The chapter title is International Organizations and Technologies of Governance. And the chapter takes as a starting point the fact that social problems are increasingly transnational in scope. And as a result, the number of international organizations has proliferated in order to address these problems. So to give you just a short statistic, in 1956, we had 136 intergovernmental organizations and 980 international non-governmental organizations. Today, we have close to 8,000 intergovernmental organizations and over 60,000 international non-governmental organizations. So the growth has just been tremendous in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. And these organizations have had their successes, but they also have their pathologies. And so for this reason, we decided to focus on international organizations and technologies of governance. Or rather, what are the practices, techniques, forms of knowledge, expertise, and infrastructures, legal and otherwise, that these organizations use to govern? And I personally like the term technologies of governance because it takes the term technology, which often refers to a machine or a device, and puts the emphasis on people, organizations, practices, and the ways that they are held together, which is a very STS way of seeing the world. So to give you some examples, technologies of governance may refer to legal technologies, such as multilateral conventions, model laws, legislative guides, guides to practice, model contracts, standards and codes, and best practices. Technologies of governance may also include accountability practices, such as international courts, and not only rulings of international courts, but the ability of international courts to be able to put pressure on different entities. International arbitration bodies, such as those associated with the WTO, formal and informal forms of reporting, and of course, peer review. And then lastly, when we're thinking about technologies of governance, we thought about indicators. And indeed, a number of the people who were affiliated with this chapter were already looking at the social construction of indicators. What forms of expertise or knowledge are associated with indicators? How do they allow certain groups or certain countries to exert power in the world? So indicators which capture the presence or absence of an underlying phenomena by the uniform application of a set of measures to all countries in the world. So example indicators could be indicators for freedom of the press, indicators for rule of law, economic development, etc. Our chapter is not quite 50,000 words, but it is around 30,000 words. And it is broken up into a series of case studies in the following domain areas. We have case studies on human rights, intellectual property, women's rights, climate change, conflict, security, and terrorism, health, and finally, refugees and migration. And these areas were chosen based on the expertise of those who were working in the group. But if there was an area where we didn't have expertise within the group, such as climate change, outside people were consulted. We all contributed to shaping the argument and the content of the report. In terms of the writing, I mostly contributed to the intellectual property section and then also thinking about the conclusion. The intellectual property section, just briefly to provide an overview of content, focused on the international dimensions of intellectual property. In particular, it looks at pharmaceutical patents and the access to medicine movement. It looks at copyright law and movements around access to knowledge. And finally, traditional knowledge. And someone had asked about outcomes or suggestions for future research agendas. The section argues for further work on developing competing normative frames, such as human rights, that might alter international interpretations of intellectual property norms. It also argues for furthering the development of local expertise and local international competence, and also to seek to better understand the effects of applying intellectual property frames to a diverse world. And so just to conclude on this point, there's a growing body of
science and technology by other means. Please.
Good afternoon. Oh, yes, it works. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizer, not only for having invited me, but also for organizing such a huge conference. I feel that the room is really impressive, and I'm sure it will be a great success. To start, as has been said just before, I would say that I have been working for several years on the construction of knowledge and expertise by people concerned with health issues, firstly inside internet groups of patients, and more recently in patient organizations. And it is, of course, from this perspective that I understand and translate the topic of this panel in the following way. Has patient experience or patient experiential knowledge the potential to constitute by other means of doing science and technology? Does it represent an alternative to mainstream science? Has it the power to question it, to challenge it, to make it more democratic? Could it contribute to Donna Haraway's project of a practice of objectivity that privileges contestation, deconstruction, passionate construction, webbed connections, and hope from transformation of systems of knowledge and ways of seeing? So to try to answer this question, I'm going to contrast two sets of configuration. The first one concerns patient groups, and I will try what we, and I just take the opportunity to tell you who is behind this we, the people who work in the European project that was just mentioned before, so that we have learned from what they do with experience. The second one is newer for me, and I thank the conveners for giving me the opportunity to have a closer, if a very preliminary look at it, and it is centered around activities of private actors as well as researchers or institutions who have decided to give patient experience a quite important role in research. My curiosity, in fact, has been aroused by the emergence of a rhetoric around the notion of patient-centered care, accompanied by the development of a discourse on the involvement and the participation of concerned people to research, and of research drawing on what is called patient-reported outcomes. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe the different ways in which people's experience is enacted, how it is mobilized in knowledge production, and I want to reflect on the kind of politics it performs and on the extent to which it could be considered as science by other means. So for about 25 years, there has been a significant number of studies that have enriched our vision of the engagement with knowledge of formal and informal groups of people concerned by a health problem. I think, of course, of Stephen Epstein's contribution, of Phil Brown and his colleagues' contribution on environmental health, on my colleagues Volodona Rabirosoa and Michel Callon's contribution on rare disease, and of many, many other scholars that have been taking part to this effort. These studies have highlighted the importance of patients' expertise based upon their experience, notion which is today largely taken up by professionals, researchers, policymakers as a legitimation of patient involvement into research or health policy making. The importance taken by knowledge-related activities in the functioning of patient organizations prompted us to forge the expression evidence-based activism, which highlights the centrality of the articulation between knowledge and politics in this form of activism, and the work which is necessary to perform this articulation. This work may have various objectives, and I would like to mention 4 of them. First of all, it's a matter of helping concerned people themselves to allow each one to benefit from others' experience, to share difficulties, doubts, experimentations, solutions, so that everyone can recover or enhance his or her capacity of reflection and action. So the work performed by Ding Ding Dong, an organization which is devoted to Huntington disease, which calls itself Institute for the Co-production of Knowledge on Huntington Disease, offers a striking example. They leave to others the fight for a cure, and they put all their energy into inquiries in relation to a question which is directly linked to the development of genetic testing: how to live with a life whose origin is a predicted and inescapable disaster, how to compose with a disease, as they say in their website. Secondly, it's a matter of making certain issues visible in the public space. The history of organizations concerned with rare disease, emergent disease, and environmental health problems is intimately linked to the collection of experiential data that could help people making sense and dealing with the problems they are confronted, and would help to constitute issues at stake and get others interested into these issues. Beyond the objective of raising awareness, it's also a matter of identifying issues, of constituting matters of concern out of matters of fact. Here is, for example, the case of an organization on renal disease. They organized a large survey, and they found out that access to kidney transplant was correlated with patients' level of education. Nobody has anticipated such a result before the survey was completed, and this result contributed to the definition of the organization's program of action. Thirdly, it's a matter of discussing, arguing, and negotiating with concerned actors. To transform institutions and establish practices, patient organizations need to convince their interlocutors. Claiming that diseases are rare but patients numerous has needed a meticulous inventory of thousands of dispersed disease and the gathering of patients. Lastly, patient organizations may engage themselves into some scientific research because of the absence of interest of academic researchers for research questions that they consider central for patients. Here is the example of the French Death Daughters organizations that launched in 2013 an epidemiological study in order to find out whether or not the risk of getting a breast cancer was higher than in the general population. In fact, 2 previous studies in the US, in the Netherlands, has shown divergent results. Thus, the importance for the French Death Daughters to know what to expect in order to adjust their medical follow-up. So to produce this knowledge, Patient organizations rely on a variety of methods, from very informal ones, discussions between volunteers in contact to people seeking help, to formalized surveys or even scientific research undertaken in collaboration with professional researchers. One crucial point is that they don't content to produce knowledge based on experience, but articulate it to other forms of knowledge, and notably biomedical knowledge. Contrary to what have been sometimes suggested, they don't lose their soul by getting their nose into scientific affairs. It is precisely their capacity to articulate these two kinds of expertise that gives them the capacity to act upon the health system and to transform it. How did, for example, a French cyber organization criticize guidelines on episiotomy? They did a careful bibliographical review that allowed them to highlight the variety of practices and the singularity of French ones. They gathered testimonies that showed several complications of episiotomy that, from women's point of view, have severe consequences on their everyday life and that have been neglected both by the literature and the guidelines. And they ended by reframing the problem not as a prevention of episiotomy, an expression that naturalized the intervention, but as a prevention of perineal lacerations that opens up a whole set of other policy options, such as positions during labor, but that also points out the oversimplification associated with experimental protocols of research, excluding the collection of data on situations where women were free to choose their position. So experiential knowledge thus gives the perspectives from which the situatedness of biomedical knowledge can be seen, and here the exercise of power on women's bodies on which it relies. However, the production of knowledge shouldn't only be characterized by its outcomes. It is a political activity in itself, in the sense that it seeks to engage a whole community, not only as object of this knowledge or as information providers, but also as active participants. Here you can see an announcement for the SOS Back to School operation, a hotline which is open every September, October, for parents of children with ADHD, seeking solutions to urgent problems when their children return back to school. The twofold nature of the operation, providing help, producing knowledge, is made explicit, so that parents have the possibility to anticipate when calling and adapt their testimony to the second objective. In another register, as Tiago Moreira showed, the efforts deployed by Alzheimer's Society UK to find innovative methods in order to hear the voices of those who can't speak anymore are a way of performing an organization which would not only be an organization of carers and relatives, but also of patients themselves. Besides, patient organizations often provide opportunities for people to express themselves in a discursive form. They organize spaces for collecting testimonies or add open-ended questions to their survey. So people are invited to adopt an active and reflexive attitude and to reanalyze their experience in light of the context which is suggested by the survey in a way that may contribute to the collective understanding of issues. We see that producing knowledge is indeed performing the collective. So to conclude this part, I want to return to my starting point, that is experience and science. 2 points about experience. Experience doesn't go without saying. It's not something which is out there once for all. It is always a product of some interaction that occurs either between human beings via the mediation of a questionnaire or via the confrontation with other testimonies. Experience is constantly reworked in these interactions, and at a collective level, the elaboration of experiential knowledge and expertise out of experiences is a very process through which both the collective and the issues it has to face are constructed. So working on with experience is trying to find a way in the messy and dense web of events, thoughts, feelings, worries that constitute everyday life of each concerned individual by building connections with others' lives. In this quest, and as that is my second point, science and technology are not alien. As many STS scholars have demonstrated, they are mediators in the relationship people entertain with their body and their disease. They participate in the constitution of their experience at the individual level, and at a collective level, it's one way of building the connection I was just talking about. Should we think of these knowledge-oriented activities as science by other means? I'm not sure, and I'm even reluctant to use the expression research in the field, which was forged by Michel Conan and his colleagues in acting in an uncertain world. I think that in trying to lay knowledge on an equal footing with expert knowledge and to analyze their interrelations, this expression runs the risk of reducing these activities to their contribution to science. That is the reason why I think it would be a category error, to borrow from Bruno Latour. Even in cases where a collective inquiry results in a scientific publication, patient organizations are not interested in scientific research for the sake of scientific research. What they are interested in is making sense of people's experience, building collectives, and providing opportunities and capacity for individual and collective actions. So let's now turn to people who seek to inject patients' experience in scientific research. Since the beginning of the 2000s, we witnessed the importance of two sets of initiatives that can be put under the label of patient-centeredness in healthcare and health research. Firstly, within research activity, it translates into the increasing use of patient-reported data, as you can see on the curve, and the development of outcome measures based upon this data. Interestingly, this move concerns public research, as illustrated by the creation of CORI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, an American funding institution that has already spent $1.4 billion on this theme since 2012, as well as the private sector with the creation of platforms such as the well-known Cure Together or Patients Like Me, or more recently, the Open Research Exchange platform, which has been described by its creator, Patients Like Me, as the first open participation research platform for creating outcome measurement. Secondly, there is a pressing movement urging researchers and research institutions to associate patients to the governance of research, meaning to have them participating to the setting of research agenda, the elaboration of research protocols, or various forms of assessment exercise. This tendency is reflected by the patient revolution undertaken by the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, in 2013, or the creation in 2015 of a journal, Research, Involvement and Engagement, which is entirely devoted to these issues. The arguments in favor of such initiatives range from political to economic and epistemic one. Experiential knowledge from those directly affected is supposed to improve the quality and relevance of research. Patient engagement is seen as a way to help health systems become sustainable, as it should reduce healthcare costs through the avoidance of unnecessary investigation, treatment, and irrelevant research projects. It is also considered as a democratic imperative. For the BMG, I quote, a fundamental shift in the power structure in healthcare and a renewed focus on the core mission of health systems is at stake. Professionals need to accept that expertise in health and illness lies outside as much as inside medical circles. It is also considered as the first steps towards a more desirable model of care, patient-centered care, which takes into consideration patients' needs, expectations, preferences, and real-life conditions. As you can see on the slides of the Compare project, which seeks to develop, it's a French project, which seeks to develop a huge platform with the same spirit as the Open Research Exchange platform created by patients like me. Expressions such as participatory research, collaborative research, involvement, patient expertise, empowerment are part of the quite positive rhetoric around this movement. I'm not going to elaborate more on it, but I want to look at the practices which sustain this discourse with one question in mind. Which patients, contributors, and what kind of experience are performed into these practices? One common feature to these different tools and to procedures that aim to involve patients is that they almost always target the individual patient. Numerous tools for collecting data for patients are questionnaires, similar to this one you can see, whose aim is to determine the individual patient's status, how she or he feels about the disease, the impacts of treatment on her or his life, or the things she values the most in his life, or that she is keen to preserve despite the disease. No space is generally left for free expression, since it is important for researchers to rely upon robust tools that they can exploit and use in a variety of contexts. Hence, here, producing knowledge is about being able to aggregate data. Together with the interpretation of data, this should remain in the hands of professionals and researchers. If this, in fact, didn't come for me as a surprise, I was not expecting that the same would apply for procedures that aim to involve patients. I was lucky enough that the Research Involvement and Engagement Journal was created only a year ago, so that it was still possible to have a look to the 36 papers which have been published to date. In almost all cases, involved people are individuals, apparently without any strong engagement within patient groups. Everywhere there is an emphasis on the necessity to gather a representative sample of the diverse targeted population, but as can be seen on these quotes, nobody is supposed to represent anyone else than her or himself. Here, the model of representations seems to be a statistical one. What is meant by experience or expertise by experience is supposed to pre-exist to the situation in which it is mobilized. In this perspective, the questionnaire collecting patient data makes only the useful part of experience visible in a standardized and manageable way. Experience is a property of the individual, something that allows him or her to have something to answer to the question addressed to her and him. What is true in this configuration is also true in involvement procedures. In particular, the question of whether these involved patients should receive a training is discussed. Some argue that it would ease the dialogue with researchers. Others think it is not necessary and runs the risk of distorting patients' views. As the BMG puts it is, I quote, important to get the authentic voice of patients heard and not just that of an articulate minority. As a consequence, in a document explaining to potential candidates what is patient peer review, they insist on the fact that no medical or scientific training is needed. Indeed, a twofold operation is performed through this definition of experience. Firstly, a gap between scientists and lay people, between science and experience, is reenacted. In questionnaires, patients are expected to provide facts, feelings, and opinions, but in contradiction to the Compare project advertisement I showed you before, not something that would look like an expertise. In the same vein, here is an example of what experts sitting on a health technology appraisal committee from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence say about patients' written statements. These experts' view clearly theorize patients' contribution as opposed to scientists in the most traditional, and I would personally add sexist and backward way. Secondly, through the collection of patient-reported outcomes, researchers position themselves as spokesperson of the patients, shortcutting other forms of representation, and especially those built by patient organizations. Just an anecdote on this point. I recently had an interview with the researchers which is implied in the COMPARE project. And at some point he told me, I'm suspicious of patient organizations. When I asked why, he replied, because they are activists. This is a bit ironic considering his engagement in an epistemic project with a strong and explicit political aspect. So I don't want to give the impression that researchers and credentialed expert people are just bad guys. I think that they probably don't have much STS books on their bedside table, but I think it's something which is perfectly understandable. But at least what I can say is that they are involved into a modernist project that pretends to solve the problem of politics by doing sciences. Despite the denegations, one paper out of 3 in Research Involvement and Engagement journal uses the word tokenism to distance themselves from the practice this word qualifies, and I put some example here. The revolution called by the BMG might turn out to be more of an endogenization of politics or a capture of the public than anything else. In this respect, the 1999 BMG cover page on patient partnership, which shows a domineering medicine capturing the patient, forcing her to him or him to follow his step and to be drawn into its eyes, again using gender stereotypes, might be more representative of what is at stake than the 2013 triumphant cover page. So to conclude, we end up with what can be seen as a paradox. The question raised at the starting of this presentation was more or less implicitly imbued with a positive connotation towards the idea that experience or experiential knowledge could be science by other means, thus opening up science to a more democratic and inclusive functioning. At the end of the day, we are confronted on the one hand with knowledge practices that cannot be considered as science, but that have a reflexive and disruptive potential as regards science, and on the other hand, with scientific practices that are supposed to draw upon people's experience to build a more democratic science and healthcare, but end up taking away any critical capacity from concerned people and closing down any possibility of debate. It raises 2 issues for we, STS scholars. Firstly, STS has put a strong emphasis on participation and democracy in science, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There is clearly a need to investigate the politics of participation, which is embedded not only into procedures, but into science itself. Secondly, as I have suggested, the framing of the question raised in this session reveals a positive bias in favor of science. But if we are interested in democracy, then we should take more seriously the multiplicity of knowledge and ask ourselves on what conditions it is possible to preserve or to enhance people's capacity to engage into inquiries on matters they feel concerned with, and what kinds of institutions and procedures are needed to properly articulate these inquiries to scientific activity to make it more open to the plural possible words. Thank you for your attention.
Hello. First, I wanted to begin by experimenting with the microphone. It seemed a little echoey. How is it a little bit farther away? Is that good? Okay. I wanted to begin by thanking the program organizers for inviting me to this opening keynote, and to thank Madeline for her paper, and to thank you for sitting here in this room that's a little bit stuffy, where we're in here kind of breathing together. And with every inhalation, we are breathing in industrially produced chemicals. We're drawing in molecules into our being. Once inhaled, these molecules may pass through membranes, they may connect with receptors, they may mimic hormones, they may modulate gene expression, thereby they might be triggering a whole cascade of metabolic activities inside of you. So breathe in. We can't help it. Like, we have to eat, we have to breathe, we don't really have any choice. And so this is one of the conditions of our being. With each breath, we are kind of recommitting to a relationship with the building materials, with consumer products, with oil spills and agricultural pesticides, with factories that are near and far, all that are contributing to the emission of these synthetic molecules. So, every one of you, like everyone living today, has persistent organic pollutants woven into your being. PCBs and DDE, a metabolite of DDT, are in every one of us here, joining up with a more regional or idiosyncratic mixture exuded by capitalist exuberance. So we can think of phthalates, we can think of bisphenol A, PBDE, the flame retardant, lead, organochlorine pesticides. The list really could go on and on. We are enmeshed in these chemical relations. So I can say all this with the help of a kind of motley and diverse array of disciplines, things like metabolomics, epigenetics, biomonitoring, toxicology, each one of which offers a kind of instrument-mediated, micrological glimpse into the vastness of our chemical relations, relations that extend far out from our skin, out into electrical systems that used PCBs as thermal insulation, out into post-colonial pesticide regimes that sprayed DDT around the world in the name of crop yield and public health, out into the plastosphere of our packaging and cheap consumer products, out into the infrastructures of environmental racism that concentrate hostility and chemical violence in some bodies and security in others. So the chemical relations of our embodiment expand out into messy and violent histories of colonialism, of racial segregation and labor, into homemaking and heteropatriarchy and war. And our chemical relations also overflowed these structured exposures to become mobile on winds and currents, disobeying territories and social stratigraphies, stretching forward in time after the factory is gone, after the war is over, after the product is no longer on the shelf, after maybe you no longer have a job, after maybe you are no longer alive. Sometimes chemical exposures are sensible, but mostly they are not, so we are often guessing that we sense them retroactively in the symptom, the brain fog, the miscarriage, the lump, the grief that comes later. So chemical relations connect us backwards in time, but also forward into what our bodies will become, into the future environment from the webs of capitalist industrialist exuberance that we are all cumulatively assembling in our complicities and inability to extract ourselves. So we are all here, already altered by industrial chemicals, though in profoundly uneven ways. We are all here already more than bodies. This material and not metaphorical entanglement in environmental violence is the condition of being alive today. So here we are together in Barcelona, We're breathing in, we're participating in these temporal loops. We are part of these expansive interdependencies of chemical relations. So the topic tonight was, or is, embodied knowledge by other means. So what is embodiment anyways? The body does not exist as a detached and sovereign unit despite what liberal political structures tell us. Why do we think we know what a body is or what it can do, where it ends and begins, what relations compose it? In 1985, Donna Haraway posed the question, why should our bodies end at our skins? So I want to try to say with that unsettling query. As researchers, we might look to acknowledge differently situated bodies in order to correct the exercise of power in knowledge making. This is especially pressing, I think, in institutional contexts where embodiment is denied. But it's also an important part of mobilizing DIY practices, right? You don't need a lot of institutional support to mobilize embodied knowledge. Yet the demarcation of the singular, discrete body is non-innocent, even when described in a fine resolution of particulars. It is caught up in infrastructures of individual property, of wage labor, of citizenship, of whiteness. Infrastructures that, for researchers working in relatively elite settings, tend to operate by obscuring our enabling support systems, the transportation networks, or the service labor done by others. This allows particular kinds of normative bodies to appear as if they are operating as solo units. Yet non-innocent bodies are caught up in each other's conditions of life support and diminishment. From the epidermal schema of anti-Black racism to the heteropatriarchy of gender, bodies are already caught in painful and contradictory matrices of support and negation. My livelihood requires me to take in an injury. Drinking water, I am exposed. Embodiment is a collective binding of profoundly uneven relations, of porosity to exposure. My vulnerability to injury is entangled with your comfort. The side effect accompanies the treatment. I am kept alive even as I am being killed. So at the metabolic and chemical level, embodiment is already altered, already non-innocently embroiled in uneven, violent relations of being and doing. So if we accept this as a starting point, that embodiment does not provide a kind of respite or escape from history or from infrastructures or from relations of power, if we accept that bodies cannot get you out of entanglements, then we might want to find alternative genealogies for grappling with embodiment by other means, for STS. So taking Frantz Fanon as a starting point for a decolonial STS, we might begin by noticing how he navigated and refused to disavow the contradictions making up embodiment, how Fanon theorized within a set of tensions. For example, the tension between the hopeful care of embodied difference and the pessimistic ways bodies are already materialized in racism and colonialism. The tension between medicine's apprehension of pathology and the ways that the bodies exceed those materializations. Fanon held these tensions together beautifully in his theorizations of Blackness, but also in his theorizations of how medicine and science might try to break with the complicities of colonialism. So learning from and making kin with the decolonial projects of Fanon, as well as other fields like Black studies or Indigenous studies, queer studies, a decolonial sense of embodiment might embrace Fanon's anti-colonial call to become a new humanity, a new life form, one which requires destroying the version of the human that deep histories of violence have made. So it is this bundle of tension, it is in this bundle of tension that I want to get us thinking about how we might fashion a politics of decolonial STS, with and against the body. So rerouting STS through Fanon also requires that we consider the question of what has to be seized, what has to be rebuilt, and what has to be dismantled to make room for decolonial potentials. White supremacy, maybe? How about some petrochemical extraction? Maybe some of you have other things you want to nominate for dismantling. The individualized body is given to us by Western liberal and capitalist political structures as a container for rights and labor and risks and capital, as well as biological processes and health. This I don't think will do. The singularized body alone cannot dismantle the disturbing entanglements of knowledge-making within violent infrastructures. Moreover, the body itself is in need of dismantling if we are to stay within the tension of recognizing violence and becoming something else. So, what materializations of life and embodiment might we think with and against to confront the 21st century condition of industrial chemical enfleshment? How to conjure decolonial futures and not just accounts of bodily damage along with industrial chemicals that are part of us and also remaking the planet. So at stake in summoning alter embodiments is the very sense of what constitutes life and its relations. Within the biological sciences, we all know that there's no unified theory of life. Even as the units of gene and body and species and ecosystem get used as such a commonplace so that they appear as if they're in the world and not particular historical materializations of it. So making decolonial possibilities requires theorizing life with and against technoscience. A politics of embodiment by other means might learn from and propagate politics and concepts in the tension between violences that have already happened and the need to undo them nonetheless, between the condition of being already altered and the struggle to become otherwise in the aftermath. We might, I suggest, call this alter embodiment alter life, a state of already having been altered by environmental violence that is nonetheless a capacity to become something else. The concept of alter life is forged in recognition of the realities of large-scale violences as well as everyday environmental violence. Alter life is not waiting for a kind of apocalypse on the horizon. Apocalypses of many kinds have already happened. Livable worlds keep getting snatched away all around us. Alter life resides in what Fanon called an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. It is a condition that is shared, but unevenly so. It divides us as much as it binds us. So I've come to alter life while studying chemical violence on the Great Lakes, as industrial chemicals deliver concentrated injury and premature death to indigenous, Black, and poor communities already living in hostile conditions. The Great Lakes were a portal to the colonial conquest of Canada. And in the 20th century, the lower Great Lakes in particular became rimmed by the industrial exuberance of car manufacturing and petrochemical refining, more recently given over to histories of deindustrialization and abandonment. The Great Lakes are a jurisdictional patchwork. They're cut up by 2 different settler nations, over 145 different indigenous territories, 2 provinces and 8 states, so it's a real mess to try to regulate. Overwhelmingly, the Great Lakes are governed by a permission to pollute regulatory system, and our data about emissions are self-reported by industry. A legacy of persistent industrial chemicals have spread ubiquitously across the region, and in the aftermath, environmental researchers go and gather the data of damage in bodies. So Ultralife has become a political concern for me as I live in Toronto on Lake Ontario, which is the most polluted of the Great Lakes, on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories, and in Canada, a settler, colonial, and petro-extraction state. The question of ultralife is shaped by a sense of political and personal responsibilities to the Great Lakes, to its water, to its land, to its histories, to my own position as a white Métis person with responsibilities to my complicities in settler colonialism and whiteness, as well as to the histories and current activisms of indigeneity. So I recognize that altered life for me is kind of autobiographical, and it's really emplaced in a particular site of the Great Lakes. Altered life is a concern for me because my neighbors are bodies of water that hold 21% of the world's fresh surface water and 84% of North America's. That's a lot. And while in the media and the news, what you mostly might hear about Canada these days is how handsome our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is, on the ground, a Canadian neoliberal managerial governance combined with a kind of extraction state have really come together to form a potent environmentally violent mix that is even genocidal. And this expresses itself in the pollution of the Great Lakes. Around my home in Toronto is a surge of environmental and reproductive justice activism focused on the water that my sense of altered life learns from and aspires to collaborate with. So I want to pause here and point out a shift in the way that I've posed the research question of altered life or altered embodiment. In the past, I've typically approached histories of environmental and reproductive practices by asking, how do activist practices mobilize their bodies in order to create alternative materializations of bodies? Or let me kind of put that more simply, how do particular practices materialize particular modes of being? Or to even put it more simply, how does doing materialize being? That's the way that I've typically tried to ask questions. And tonight I want to play with and experiment with you with a different way of thinking about embodied knowledge that really comes from the opposite direction. Can we think of going from being to doing? I want to start with kind of creating or summoning an alter embodiment, an alter object of care, even if only conjecturally, that can call in our complicities, that maybe require less violent practices, that maybe even require a different world. I want to think about tactically moving from being to doing, calling forth alter embodiments, alter beings, or what I'm trying to call alter life. So calling forth alter life and new life forms is really a work in progress. And from the start, I've been trying to do it in conversation and collaboration with many friends, with many students, colleagues, activists, artists. Alter life is just, I think, one attempt at conjuring an alter embodiment with a particular STS inflection and in solidarity with reproductive and environmental justice on the Great Lakes. So I think there's other ways of kind of conjuring alter embodiment that we could share with each other. With alter life, I'm trying to think with Fanon as a guide and maybe draw out for you 3 political stakes that are involved in this alter embodiment. So the first political stake. Alter life is about a politic of entanglement, kinship, and responsibility. The entanglements making up alter life are not just like the symbiosis of multi-species being, but the material entanglements with chemical exposures. This is an entanglement with violence. These exposures include pollution, like we might think about it, but it could also be the molecular manifestations of the stress of living in assault, in racist or highly militarized or really violent conditions. No single person escapes enfleshments with exposures, even as their violent effects are profoundly concentrated in hot spots of hostility. And even as many of us here live in conditions of dense privilege that encourage a willful ignoring of these tentacles of violence. Altered life as a becoming with exposures exists in this profoundly uneven and interdependent distribution of life chances. So those of us who benefit from whiteness have much work to do in calling forth alter life, not least of which is the responsibility to dismantle the work of whiteness in the sciences and in the institutions that we inhabit that are often densely enriched by colonial and racist systems. But even if you're just trying to get by, quotidian and humble complicities are built into our world. They're built into the very acts of sheltering and eating and cleaning that are in turn knotted to this kind of cacophony of consumption, with harms built into the supply chain of capitalism, and with harms built into the discard systems that are in our objects. Ordinary survival is tethered to a kind of continual spewing of injury. Our relations are not just supportive, they can also be injurious and toxic to each other. Vanessa Agar-Jones calls this chemical kinship. Thus, a crucial aspect of calling forth alter life is that it is about an understanding of oneself, the researcher, in kinships with objects of concern or objects of care. Attention to alter life asks not for a politics of fixing others, but in the words of Fred Moten, your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly. So within the condition of alter life, the potential for political kinship and alter relations comes out of this recognition of your imbrications in the tangle of support and harm. So that's number one. Number two, with alter life, I'm trying to think with and against technoscience. And I'm interested in this kind of toggle or tension, with and against. So I want to push back, in particular, against the technoscientific framings of damaged, injured, abnormal life in scientific fields such as ecology, toxicology, epigenetics, what we might call damage-based research. With alter life, I want to push back on the eugenic residual that calculates life worth living, deviant lives, risky lives, unproductive lives, killable lives. The work of Carla Hustek has brought home to me just how deeply entwined this eugenics residual has been in the history of progressive and even feminist scientific projects. Thus, in summoning alter life, I'm collaborating with and pushing back against scientific understandings, let's say from epigenetics or metabolomics, that try to trace and provide data of the damage of environmental violence. To this end, I find inspiration in the work of Indigenous feminist scholar Eve Tuck, who has called for suspending damage as a refusal to participate in damage-based research. Damage-based research that concentrates the scope of attention on the dissection of bodies and biologies and metabolisms that are then reductively constituted as pathological and devalued. Invasive organisms are to be removed. Birds damaged in oil spills are to be culled. Disturbed lands becomes terra nullius, open to any kind of capitalist development. Designations of damage can feed these circuits that amplify damage, where to be altered and unfixable is to be held as diminished, and then perhaps better to not exist at all. Suspending damage is a challenge, I think, to our environmental justice habits, and at the same time an invitation to maybe create new kinds of research questions that are trying to build decolonial or other kinds of worlds now without waiting for a better moment to arise. Okay, this brings me to my last political stake for alter life. Alter life is about potential, the potential to become otherwise. Embodiment has not just been altered, it is more generally open to alteration. Alter life is already recomposed, pained, damaged, yeah, but it's potential nonetheless. So alter life as potential challenges us to learn with a thick archive and dense presence of projects of resistance and resurgence. It is also an invitation to consider what infrastructures and concepts have to be dismantled to make room for another way of being and knowing to emerge. It is an invitation to begin inhabiting alter embodiments right now. A core teaching of Indigenous reproductive and environmental justice activism is that bodies are not separable from land, water, air, and other beings. For Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and young people on the front lines of pipeline blockades, of water walks, of fasts, of land defense actions, whose lives are ongoingly violated by extractive industries, this teaching is really unavoidable. What happens to the water is part of what happens to you. Violence on the land is violence on bodies, and this includes you too. So I share these images with you with permission of their creator, the Métis artist and activist, Erin Consmo, who's a coordinator at Native Youth Sexual Health Network in Toronto, which is an incredible organization. This is a piece called Our Bodies Are Not Terra Nullius. Terra nullius is a legal term, or better yet, a legal fiction, meaning empty territory, which is used to support a state's claim of sovereignty over lands they find. In Canada, terra nullius has been crucial to the state's claim to ownership of Indigenous territories, that it then leases to multinational companies like petrochemical companies or mining companies like Suncor or De Beers, resulting in a kind of theft of territory, but also a concentration of environmental violence in Indigenous communities. So we see this history in this image, in both the ways the colonial vessels and the extractive industries are inscribed onto the body. Our bodies are not terra nullius is a declaration of land defense and of prior Indigenous presence in territory. Yet I think this image also captures a second sense of our bodies are not terra nullius. Colonial and environmental violence have already happened, and here we can see the body and trauma as already surrounded by and formed through toxic violences. Yet the very creation of this image in a social justice collectivity with people on the front lines of blockades, in spaces that welcome queer and non-binary gendered being, transformed this image into an activation of decolonial embodiment, a laying claim to a body sovereignty and a care of body land entanglements in the aftermath. So bodies are not terra nullius. Our bodies are the land, they are toxic chemicals, and they are something more. They are a manifestation of something bigger that stretches outward to water, air, ancestors, other beings, that stretch backward to messy histories and forward to something else. In this image, we find an alter embodiment of survival as resistance, what Indigenous scholar Gerald Vissner calls survivance. Survivance is not just about making newness. It's not just about making relations or making entanglements. It's also about what has to end, what has to come apart to make less violent worlds. The responsibility is not just to build alter practices or alter relations, but also to dismantle, to shut it down. Alter life is life damaged, life persistent, and life otherwise, life materialized in other ways, and life exceeding our materializations. So I feel like I can almost imagine a politics of alter embodiment that provokes other kinds of practices, that needs different kinds of solidarities, that would require other kinds of interdisciplines, that would summon different kinds of experiments and pedagogies. Almost. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Madeleine. As I said at the beginning, we'd like to turn this into a conversation, an open-ended conversation. That's we have invited our speakers, they have kindly accepted, to pose a comment or a question to each other. So please, I don't know which one wants to. Who wants to? Yeah, Madeline?
Okay. Okay, so well, I think that Michel and I suppose